Dr. Michael Ruse heads the History and Philosophy of Science Initiative at Florida State University, as well as having been the Lucille T. Werkmeister Professor of Philosophy. He has authored or edited upwards of 60 books, such as A Meaning to Life in 2019, Darwinism and as Religion in 2016, and Darwinism and Its Discontents in 2006. He blogs for Higher Education, HuffPost, and reviews around 20 books per year. Additionally, he has appeared in many popular publications such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and the Washington Post, and Philosophy Now. He will momentarily be giving the talk, Why Be Good? God versus Darwin. Welcome, Dr. Ruse. We also have to give you a disclaimer really quick. There will be some very, very mild nudity in this PowerPoint, like 8th grade bio mild. So if you have a problem with that, I guess just be aware.
Leave now.
Yes, that. But other than that, we're super excited for this talk, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Ruse.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sophia. And it's been nice chatting to you and your fellow students, your colleagues. And I'm very glad to be here. I should say that I retired 2 months ago. I turned 80 in June, and I retired 2 months ago after being a prof for 55 years, 35 in Canada, and then 20 down in the States. So to a certain extent, I'm a little bit lost. I mean, I've never got up in the morning and not had to go to work. I look at my wife and I say, oh my God, am I going to spend the whole day with you? And I say, no, I didn't mean it that way. Fortunately, we've got 6 dogs, so there's plenty to keep me busy. Now, listen, what I'm going to talk about today is God and Darwin, morality, and those sorts of things. I should tell you, now, can I move this along myself, or do I ask you to move it for me?
Unfortunately, you have to ask me to move it for
Oh,
you.
no, that's not unfortunate. Okay, well, when I was asked to give this talk, I thought what I was going to do was compare humans with warthogs. Next slide, please. And okay, next slide. That's right. So I thought that this was going to be a talk about warthogs. I'm really rather fond of warthogs. I once spent a week, well, I spent a semester in South Africa, and my wife and I went up to Zimbabwe, and we went on safari. Now that's a lot posher than it sounds. It's a lot less posh than it sounds. I mean, what it meant was we stayed in a camp and went out in a van twice a day with cameras, no guns or anything like that. And there were, I can't tell you how many warthogs there were in this park. There were also lions and zebras and that sort of thing. But I found after a while, I grew rather fond of warthogs. I'd see them trotting along in their families and everything. And I've got 5 kids, so any guy who's a family man like that, gets my vote. And they're so ugly, you have to love them. You really do have to love them. So I thought I was going to talk about warthogs, but then Sophia said, oh no, not warthogs again. California, we have too many warthogs, too much warthogs. Couldn't you talk about something else? So I said, well, what if I talk about God? And she stopped and her face fell. And she said, this is California. Nobody quite knows what you're going to mean when you start talking about God. If this were, Mississippi, that'd be fine. But California, I'm not sure about that at all. But anyhow, she said, well, if you must talk about God, then let's talk about God. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about God, the chap in the sky who wears a bathrobe and sits on a cloud and looks a bit like me, only he's got a better beard. And I'm going to talk about a chap called Charles Darwin. I'll be telling you a bit more about him as we go along. This is God. Boy, he looks like looks like my headmaster. My headmaster didn't like me, and I didn't much like him. And I think I probably feel the same way about God. Anyway, what I'm going to do is talk about God, but I'm also going to talk about Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, as you probably know, was a famous scientist in the 19th century. And a lot of people today, particularly these people, I'm sure you've heard of them, the new atheists. That's Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and two or three others like that. They all say, oh, God, God is out of date. We've gone way beyond God now. We're into science, and science trumps everything, and all of those sorts of things. So what I want to talk about then today, as I say, is I want to talk about religion, but I also want to talk about science. And I want to say that the relationship between the two is much more interesting than one is right and the other is wrong and all of those sorts of things. So next slide, please. So what I'm talking about then is not just God, but what we know about God. And of course, what we know about God mainly, no, go back one, there we are. What we know about God mainly, of course, comes from the Bible. And what I'm showing you is a photograph of the first printed Bible that was done in, I think, in Germany, as you can see, in 1454. It wasn't until later on in the century, just before 1500, that William Caxton in England, took a translation of the Bible and printed it in English. But as I say, this is the first one. Not all Christians think everything in the Bible is absolutely true, or that it's all right. A lot of people, for instance, I grew up as a Quaker, and they think that as important as the Bible is the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost, and that God can and does speak to us directly. And of course, if you're Roman Catholic, then you think that there's not just the Bible, but when the Pope is speaking what they call ex cathedra, then he can give you things which you didn't know before, which are part of Christian religion, and they're not to be found in the Bible. For instance, the so-called Immaculate Conception. That's about the Virgin Mary, and that she didn't have to have regular sex to be born, and that she was born without original sin. That's not in the Bible, but it's now part of Catholic doctrine because the Pope said it is. So on the one hand, then, we've got God and we've got the Bible, at least as the fundamental work. Next, please. And then on the other hand, we've got a chap who actually looks a little bit like God, doesn't he? And this is Charles Robert Darwin, and he's an Englishman, and he's born in 1809 and died in 1882. So that means he was born when the Hanover kings, the Georges and William, were on the throne. But he died when Victoria was on the throne. So most of his life, he lived under the reign of Queen Victoria. And so he's generally known properly as a Victorian. And here's a puzzle for you. And first prize, well, Darwin was born in 1809 on February the 12th, 1809. Now, without cheating, and don't go to the internet and Google it, I'd be interested if any of you know who else was born on February the 12th, 1809. So that's a question I'm leaving for you. As I say, don't Google it because you'll get it straight off. But if anybody knows who it is, that'll be kind of interesting. Oh, there we are. Somebody's got it. Somebody's got it already. Abraham Lincoln. That's right. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin were born on the same day. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln didn't live until 1882. Even I, an Englishman, know that much about American history. But as I say, so they are kind of contemporaries. But there is a big difference. We all have the story about Abraham Lincoln being born in a log cabin and that sort of thing. Darwin was very much not born in a log cabin. His grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, the white and blue pottery that you see. And that meant that there was a huge amount of money in the Darwin family, or Darwin Wedgwood, because Darwin married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. I mean, when I say a huge amount of money, I mean Silicon Valley money. So what's interesting about that is Darwin never had to work for a living. I mean, people regarded him as a very professional scientist, but he never worked because he didn't have to. And also, Darwin was very much then part of, became Victorian society. So in other words, although Darwin was a great revolutionary, in many respects, he wasn't a rebel at all. What I mean by that is that you're not going to find Darwin saying, "Oh, I don't accept any of this. It's all wrong. Let's tear the country down and have a new morality." Oh no, 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 no. Darwin was Darwin was doing very comfortably out of his society, and at that level wasn't going to rebel against it at all. It had some very conventional views about women that I'll get to in a short while. But so as I say, but Darwin, I think, was a great revolutionary. And his big move, next please, was to come up with what's known as the theory of evolution through natural selection. And this is Darwin's great book, The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. And so just before the American Civil War, in fact. So notice what it says: on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So natural selection and struggle for life are the two things I want you to note there. As I say, just before the Civil War started, interestingly, a lot of the English supported the South in the Civil War because that's where the cotton came from. And of course, the cotton came across to England and to Lancashire, and a big part of British industry was based then on cotton, which meant it was based on the cotton grown in the southern states. So, as I say, it's interesting to note that a lot of the English were not immediately supporters of the North, even though slavery had been outlawed in England and Britain for 100 years pretty much. But the interesting thing is Darwin did come from a segment of society which was, if we call it, what we call it, liberal. And the Darwin family were very, very, always very strongly against slavery. And so when the Civil War came along, Darwin was almost exceptional in the fact that he was a great booster of the North rather than the South. So it's interesting. I think this is part of what I want to say. So again, what I'm saying is Darwin was a revolutionary, but he wasn't a rebel because the part of society that he came from was very much against slavery. He came from a lot of his family were evangelicals like William Wilberforce. And so it was natural for Darwin to be anti-slavery. Okay, so these are the two books that I'm dealing with, the Bible and The Origin of Species. And the two authors, God and Charles Darwin. And so what I want to do is talk a bit more about these. Next, please. Now, the interesting thing is, and it's no surprise to anybody, that before the new atheists came along, everybody seemed to think or thought that science and religion had to be at war. And in particular, that God and Darwin had to be at war. Why? Why? Well, because if you read the first chapter of Genesis, what you learn is that God created everything, that he did it in 6 days. He did it sequentially. Interestingly, he created light before he created the sun, which is something that you have to think about. But it went all the way through fish and plants up to mammals and those sorts of things and birds. And then finally, da-dum, he created man. And man was kind of special because he's made in the image of God. And of course, this is all particularly important because then if man was made by God, a man and woman was made by God, why aren't we perfect? I mean, it's a perfect God, all powerful. I mean, why aren't humans perfect? And because the answer that Christians give is that we're fallen. Adam and Eve ate that wretched apple in Eden or whatever it was. And because of that, they were kicked out of Eden, and Eve had to put up with childbirth. And of course, there was death and everything like that. And we were in a bad way until Jesus came along and died on the cross for our sins. In other words, Jesus was a sacrifice. And the idea is it wouldn't be any sacrifice that would do. It had to be God who was sacrificing. So this leads to the whole Christian doctrine of the Trinity, where Jesus and the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost are not thought to be separate from God, but as it were, part of God, three in one. So this is a very important part of Christian doctrine. The reason why we're saved is because Jesus died on the cross. And why did Jesus have to die on the cross? Because we're sinful. And why are we sinful if we're made by a good God? Well, because we're fallen. Adam and Eve ate the first apple, or ate the apple and got kicked out of Eden. However, what Darwin says is, oh no, oh no, there wasn't an Adam and Eve. There wasn't an Adam and Eve. No, our first parents, and there weren't just one first or two first parents, there was a whole species of them. There's a whole group. I mean, we now think at least 10,000. And they didn't come created on the sixth day, modified mud, as you might say. No, they're modified monkeys. They are descended not from monkeys that exist today, but from monkeys nevertheless. And the monkeys, in their turn, came back to the first mammals, which were little rat-like things. And then you go before that, and they're descended from reptiles, and they're descended from amphibians, and they're descended from fish. So ultimately, our great-great-grandparents are fish. And more than that, yes, the first humans we know about were not nasty, nice and nasty. But the important thing is, so were their parents. Their parents were equally nice and nasty. But like you, I mean, you're nice and nasty. Now you love your parents, but you know that sometimes your father gets really cheesed off and yells at everybody. And sometimes your mother says, "Oh, I can't stand you kids anymore. Get out of my hair. Get out of the house. I can't stand you." So, you know, if I say our parents aren't perfect, I'm not running down parents any more than I'm running down us. But what I'm saying is sin did not come into the world through first group of people, first pair of people who ate an apple and got kicked out. So a lot of people think that automatically Darwinism and Christianity have to be at war. I mean, I'm not just talking about Christianity. I could talk about Judaism and Islam and that sort of thing. But at least for the purposes of this talk, let's just stay with Christianity. So there's a big feeling that Darwinism and religion have to be at war. They always were at war, and they are today. Now, I should say that would be news to Charles Darwin. He was not a new atheist. He was not at all a new atheist. But there are certainly people today for whom the clash is certainly something real and alive. Next, please. Next. "15 years ago, in the town of Dover, Pennsylvania, you can see where it is, just down at the bottom part of Pennsylvania. 15 years ago, the school board said, if you're going to teach biology, and if you're going to teach evolution in those biology classes, then you must also teach a form of creationism, 6 days and that sort of thing. Now, I want you to get this right. I don't think anybody would say it's wrong for a good school in current affairs to talk about religion, to talk about evangelical religion. Let me put it back. There we are. To talk about religion, to talk about evangelical religion, particularly in these days when the evangelicals are so very, very powerful. So if you did it in social studies, let's say, I think everybody, starting with you and your parents, would say, I'm really glad that we're covering this and that we're learning a little bit about why evangelicals take the position that we do. But biology classes are a different matter because biology classes are science. And as you know, the US Constitution separates religion from everything else and says, yeah, you can have whatever religion you like, but keep it out of the public domain. And I'm not sure we always do, but the point is we're at that level, we're not secular, but we're a secular society. Because if we don't, we're going to spend all our time clashing between Anglicans or Episcopalians and Catholics and Muslims and pagans. And no, so the best way is don't let it come into discourse. So the US Constitution says you really shouldn't teach creationism in biology classes. They say biology classes, science classes, because that's where you're supposed to be doing science. Well, of course, the creationists don't like that. And so they brought a court case, and the court case, they were thrown out. the judge, who incidentally was a very conservative judge who'd been appointed by George W. Bush, the Republican president, said, oh no, these are biology classes. You teach biology in biology classes, and that means you teach evolution. You want to do creationism? Fine, but not in biology classes because that's religion. Well, of course, as you can imagine, a lot of the well-known religious people, particularly the evangelicals, next please, like next, like Pat Robertson, were absolutely cheesed off like you wouldn't believe. And what Pat Robertson, there's Pat Robertson. Of course, he was always on television and that sort of thing. And, okay, next please. And what Pat Robertson said, I like to say to the good citizens of Dover, if there's a disaster in your area, don't turn to God. You just rejected him from your city. In other words, you wouldn't let creationism be taught in your classes. God is tolerant and loving, but we can't keep sticking our finger in his eye forever. If they have future problems in Dover, I recommend they turn to Charles Darwin. Maybe he can help them. So in other words, basically what Pat Robertson is saying, Darwinism and Christianity are opposed. I don't like Darwinism. I like Christianity. I think our kids should be taught Christianity. And, who cares about Darwinism? Maybe you can have it a little bit, but it's not that important. So here's somebody who clearly thinks that there's a clash between religion and science, or particularly between his kind of Protestant evangelical religion and Darwinian science, believing in the theory of evolution and those sorts of things. And he thinks the two clash. But the point is, we've got people on the other side who feel exactly the same. Next, please. And this, of course, is Richard Dawkins. And I'm sure you've all heard of Richard Dawkins. He's a famous biologist. He wrote a book in the 1970s called The Selfish Gene, which was a huge bestseller, all about how social things work and why genes are always looking out for themselves. And does this mean, therefore, that we're all selfish and that sort of thing? A very popular book. And then in 2006, he wrote another book, which was even more popular, called The God Delusion. The God Delusion, where he said, all of religion is bunkum. It's all religion. And remember what he says here. At that moment, I became an atheist, and I've never looked back. That was, I think, when he was away at boarding school, and he was about 16. Apparently, up to then, he'd been quite religious. But then suddenly, he had a kind of a Saul on the way to Damascus experience in reverse. And suddenly he said, I was blind, but now I see. God does not exist. And he's been saying it ever since. I think he sold 3 million copies of The God Delusion. Not as many copies, I expect, as the Bible. So I think that when Dawkins and St. Paul get together, and St. Paul says to Dawkins, how many copies have you sold? And Richard Dawkins says very proudly, 3 million at least. And then I hope Dawkins says to St. Paul, oh, by the way, how many copies of 1 Corinthians 13 have been sold? Remember that one? Yea, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am as a tinkling brass, or something brass and a tinkling cymbal. Sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. He ends with saying, and now abide these three, faith, hope, and charity, but the greatest of these is charity. The translation is charity. What we mean is love. Dawkins has sold 3 million copies. I bet St. Paul has sold 300 million copies. So, I'm not sure it's a fair competition. But at least in our society today, you've got people like Richard Dawkins, who call themselves the new atheists. I don't know what's wrong with the old atheists, but they call themselves the new atheists. And they put science and religion in a clash. And so basically, this is what I'm interested in this little talk. Next, please. This is what I'm really interested in. I'm not going to talk about everything, but I'd like to talk a little bit about morality. I'd like to talk a little bit about moral behavior. Now, of course, this is Mother Teresa, Christian. And so I think that when most people today would ask about Christianity and what you should do. I'm not saying everybody, but I bet an awful lot of people would say, well, you should behave like Mother Teresa. Remember what Mother Teresa, she was a nun. I think originally she was Albanian, from Europe, from Eastern Europe, but from the Baltic countries. But she went to India and founded her particular group. And they spent all their time caring for the sick and poor and helpless and everything like that in India. And of course, in, I mean, I'm not saying that we're much better, but there's an awful lot of people in India who don't have enough food, who have terrible diseases, who are dying, and nobody cares for them. And Mother Teresa and her nuns went out there and took these people in, looked after them, cleaned them, bathed them, fed them, and as they were dying, saw them safely out of this world and into the next. And I think most people would say, yes. Now, why is Mother Teresa doing this? Well, because she's a Christian. And why would a Christian do this? And they'd say, well, look in the Bible. All right, look in the Bible. Where do I look in the Bible? Well, how about looking at Matthew 5 through 7? That's the Sermon on the Mount. And in the first chapter has what are known as the Beatitudes. And Jesus says bluntly to you, bluntly, he says, don't look after yourself and don't just go after all the posh and important. On this earth, look after the poor, look after the sick, look after those in need. Very interesting, he says, look after prison, care about people in prison. Jesus isn't judging them why they should be in prison. Jesus isn't saying they shouldn't be in prison. Of course, you got a murderer, they should be in prison. But Jesus isn't saying that. He's saying, whether you like it or not, a murderer is a fellow human being. And that means at some level, we have a moral obligation to care about them. It doesn't mean to say we've got to be soft. It doesn't mean to say we've got to let them out or anything like that. No, 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 no. But it does mean that we've got to treat them with basic dignity. It would not be appropriate in a prison just to let them all starve and keep them in chains and that sort of thing until they die too quickly. That's not how Christians behave. And so this, I think, Mother Teresa epitomizes what people think of as Christianity. I'm not saying it's only Christian. Of course, it isn't only Christianity. I mean, Muslims are take just as seriously the call to look after others. And look at Buddhists. I mean, again and again, Buddhism is full of, the proper way to live is not to care about yourself, but to care about others. So let's take religion more generally. So this seems to be that. Now, what about science? What about Darwinism? Next, please. Well, of course, a lot of people think, and particularly they think that Darwinism, you've all heard of social Darwinism, and they all think that Darwinism says, oh, well, might is right, get as much as you can for yourself, and who's our role model, as it were? Well, none other than Adolf Hitler, the German dictator in Germany, the Third Reich from, from 1933 to 1945, when it all came to an end. And of course, the Nazis, and they were anti-Jew, and they fought, and they were anti-poor, and certainly they were anti-sick, because the Nazis set up a huge plan of euthanasia for people who are mentally disturbed or had physical ailments and that sort of thing. I mean, at first, even more than the Jews, the Nazis went after the sick and those sorts of people. But then, of course, they turned to the Jews. And I think a lot, I mean, not only do we think that, certainly this is not Christian behavior, but I think a lot of people think this is what happens when you get rid of God. This is what happens when you don't believe in God. Certainly, this is what happens when you reject Christianity. And we know that Hitler was very contemptuous of Christianity. He thought it was a religion for softies. It's interesting whether Hitler actually believed in a God. He certainly believed in some kind of divine destiny. He thought that, for instance, when he made the absolutely stupid mistake in 1941 of invading Russia, he thought he was doing it because he was guided by destiny, that whatever it was, these spirit powers had given him this power to do this. Well, he was wrong. So as I say that, but certainly Hitler was not a Christian. And obviously, as I say, clearly turned his back on Christianity. Because no Christian, at least no Christian should, allow the Holocaust. No Christian should kill 6 million Jews because they're Jews. I mean, it's simple as that. So I think a lot of people think that Darwinism leads to that. Why? Next, please. Well, because go back to what I pointed out to you when I showed you the picture of the origin of species. Evolution through on the origin of species through natural selection, or what is it? The survival, preservation of the favored races in the struggle for life. Now, okay, what are we talking about? Now, Darwinism is a theory of evolution. What that means is tree of life. What it means is we all started with blobs, and then through the years, we developed into fairly sophisticated bacteria and that sort of thing. And then finally, I don't know, 500 or 600 million years ago, we started to get more complex organisms like fish, known as the Cambrian, known as the Cambrian explosion. So we start to get fish, we start to get plants, not very sophisticated plants at this point, not flowering plants, but mosses and those sorts of things. But then over the years, you develop, as I go through again what I said. First of all, they're still in land, still in the sea, they're fish, but they start to get up and start to breathe the air up above them. Amphibian. So then we get amphibians, and then from that we get reptiles. And as I'm sure you all know, they weren't just little lizards. They developed and developed into the best known reptiles of all, the dinosaurs. Huge great boots, huge, Tyrannosaurus rex, all the things that you see at natural history museums when you go. They always, in the main hall, they always have either a genuine fossil or a model of a fossil of Tyrannosaurus rex or Stegosaurus or something like that, or all of them. And of course, I'm sure you all know, from the dinosaurs, they went extinct about 60 million years ago, probably because a comet hit the Earth and caused dust clouds and so forth, and so they couldn't eat, but they couldn't get food. But from them evolved the birds. Actually, very interesting is that reptiles, the sex of the reptile can depend on the temperature at which the eggs are reared. In other words, if humans get pregnant, then it's a boy or a girl right from the start. I'm not talking about intersexes, but it's one or the other right from the start. And it doesn't matter whether the mother or mother-to-be lives in the tropics or in the Arctic. By going to the Arctic, she's not going to turn a girl into a boy. And by going to the Congo, she's not going to turn a boy into a girl. But with reptiles, very interestingly, when the eggs are born, fertilized, depending on the temperature, if it's one temperature lower, I'm not sure which it is. If it's a low temperature, they're all male, and a higher temperature, they're all female, or something along those lines. And of course, we get enough variation in temperature that you get both sexes. But it has been suggested that after the comet that hit the Earth, the temperature got to be, I think, so cold, or maybe it was hot because of the cloud cover. But the point is, the temperature was so extreme that only reptiles of one sex were born, or only dinosaurs of one sex were born. And so, they couldn't have any offspring. Now, I'm not sure whether that's right or wrong. But the interesting thing, for us, the interesting thing is that mammals had existed for about 200 million years ago. But at first, they were little rat-like creatures who were nocturnal, only at night. And they'd just come out at night. And of course, the big thing they were doing was avoiding the dinosaurs. They didn't want to get eaten by reptiles. But then, 60 million years ago, the dinosaurs were gone. And so the rodents came out and looked around and said, oh, I like this sunshine. I think I'll stay and grow into a monkey. Well, but this is what happened. And so you get the evolution of monkeys, and then you get the evolution of apes, and then finally you get the evolution of Homo, and Homo sapiens comes at the end. Nobody, as I say, thinks that we're descended from apes or monkeys that exist today, but we certainly are. And of course, I expect many of you know that now we know, in fact, really interesting, is that gorillas broke off first, and then chimps and humans broke off. So in other words, chimpanzees are more closely related to human beings than they are to gorillas. I mean, you look at them and you say, how could that possibly be? I mean, they're apes. They're all apes. Yes, they are. But it turns out that we are closer to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to gorillas. I must say, if you're a professor for as long as I am, you don't find that surprising at all. And if you've had 5 kids like I have, you don't find it at all surprising that we're related to chimpanzees. But that's a personal matter, another matter on the side. So, okay, but how did it happen? And this is what Darwin's genius is. Darwin said it comes about through a process called natural selection. And basically, this is like the process that animal and plant breeders do. If you're a farmer and you want, let's say, shaggier sheep or fatter cows, then what do? What you do is you go to your flock, let's say your herd, and you say, I want meatier cows. So you go through the herd and you say, yes, this 20% are clearly fatter than the rest of the herd. There's always variation. They're better. So what we'll do is we'll eat the 80% and we'll use the 20% as breeding material. Or you go to your sheep and you say, yes, I want to get shaggier sheep. Well, clearly this 20% or this 15% have better fleeces than the rest of the flock. So what I will do is send the rest of the flock off to market for, to be slaughtered for lamb and mutton and that sort of thing. And I will breed from the shaggy ones. And of course, what happens over the generations is you get beefier cows and shaggier sheep. And also notice that fanciers, as they call it, also do this. People who want birds, say, which are more beautiful than before, excuse me, then what they do is they look at their budgerigars or their canaries or whatever they are and say, yes, this little group of canaries sings better than the rest, or this little group of canaries has better tail feathers or something. So I will breed from those and not from the others. And this happens. So natural selection. Darwin said, or rather artificial selection. And Darwin said, I think that there's a process of this in the wild. That what happens, and you're seeing these animals fight, that one of them is going to be stronger, and that one's going to have offspring more than the other one. So you're going to get a natural form of selection. But why is this going to happen? Next, please. Next. Well, because you've got this struggle. You've got this struggle like you did with the lions, and struggle between humans. I mean, here we go. Okay, this is nudity, folks, but it's not really, okay? And what's going to happen, says Darwin, is one of these guys is going to win, and then look at all the girls. He's going to be the one who has lots and lots of offspring, and the guy who's left, bleeding in the mud, he'd be lucky if he has any at all. And so the next generation is going to have better and better wrestlers and that sort of thing. But notice this is not so much for beefier cows and shaggier sheep. This is to have characteristics which make you a better reproducer. So go back to the lions. So what Darwinism says is there's always going to be this, what he calls a struggle for existence, but it's really a struggle for reproduction. And you're going to get one kind of struggle which makes for bigger, stronger animals and that sort of thing, like with the lions. And next, please. And then you're going to get another kind of selection, which occurs because of sexual selection, which occurs because animals fight each other for access. It's not necessarily a question of being better or something. Look at the peacock. The peacock, as something looking after itself, is a shambles. I mean, look at that tail. And if predators come along, how's the peacock going to get anywhere? I mean, peacock's not able to escape. But so why does the peacock have this wonderful tail? Well, because peahens, lady peacocks, like them. Bigger the better. And so this is why the peacock has a wonderful tail. Not because it's stronger, not because of natural selection, but because of the related sexual selection. So what I'm showing you here is an example of sexual selection as opposed to what I showed you before, natural selection. Next, please. Next. Now, what a lot of people say is, this points directly to Hitler, because what Darwinism is saying is be strong, be tough, push your opponent into the mud and stamp on him, and then go off and reproduce. So, in other words, what a lot of people say is, oh yeah, Darwinism leads straight to Hitler, because what was Hitler's philosophy? Might is right. If you look at the book he wrote in 1925, Mein Kampf, that's what he says right down the line. He says, it's not a question of being soppy and Christian. It's a question of winning, being stronger than the others. And so what I'm saying to you, my fellow Germans, is that we have got to be stronger than everybody else. And so what I'm proposing to do is build a society which will be tougher, more warlike, and everything than others. And of course, when he got to power in 1933, and he founded what was known as the Third Reich, he did that immediately. He broke the Versailles Treaty and started to build an army, started to build a navy, and also, most importantly, started to build an air force. So in 1939, when the World War did start, when Hitler marched into Poland and France and Britain, in response, declared war on Hitler, what happened was that Hitler had got all these things, these powers, this army and everything like that. So he could say, okay, let's fight it out. And as it happened, I'm a hell of a lot stronger than you are, and I'm going to win. And you'll know that by 1940, the middle of 1940, it seemed that Hitler was right. It seemed he was right. Because what did they do? They marched into France. And the French were absolutely pathetic. The German tanks poured through the Dardanelles, poured into France, and the French army couldn't stop them at all. And the next thing is they're in Paris, and what happens to the Brits who are there to help them? They're cowering on the coast, and thank God the weather was good, and they got them off back to England. That's Dunkirk. And then, of course, what happened for the next year is Hitler started to bomb England, what's known as the Blitz, and started to blow up towns one after another. As I say, I was born in 1940, June the 21st, just I think 2 days or 3 days after France was conquered. And then for the first year of my life, I lived in Birmingham in British Midlands, where every night almost it was being bombed. And my father told me once, he said, I came home one afternoon after being at work. He worked for the equivalent of the AAA, the American Automobile Association. He worked for the British equivalent known as the RAC, Royal Automobile Club. And he said, I came home and there was my wife, my young wife, my mother was only 21 or 22, sitting on an orange crate outside a smoldering house, bomb smoldering house, holding her 3-month-old baby. That was me. So, in other words, it looked like Hitler was on a roll. So, as I say, this is what it seems to work. It seems to work. And this is why it leads to Hitler. As I say, what happened, of course, was it turned out that Hitler wasn't the strongest in the end. He wasn't the strongest. He took on both Russia, which is huge, and particularly the best soldiers that Russia had was that terrible, terrible winter. Really wiped out. I mean, it wiped out the Germans. They just couldn't fight in those kind of conditions. They just didn't know what to do. And then, of course, Hitler also declared war on America, and that was it. I mean, he was done for. But again, it seems all to be might is right. And so it seems that Darwinism is about as far from Christianity when it comes to morality as it's possible to be. So in other words, it does seem that Pat Robertson on the one side is right and Richard Dawkins is on the other side is right. Well, hold it, folks. because this is where the story gets a lot more interesting. This is where the story gets hugely more interesting. Because Charles Darwin was not a warlike man. Charles Darwin was not somebody who was always thirsting to beat the hell out of others. Oh no, Charles Darwin was the guy who came from a family which was violently opposed to slavery. Charles Darwin came from a family which felt incredibly strongly that you really ought to care about other people. You ought to care about other people in need. And caring about other people in need does not mean having them as your slaves. That is not how people behave. Now, I think, as I said, I think Darwin was a person of his culture, and I'm sure that Darwin got these ideas from Christianity. They didn't come from nowhere. I mean, as I say, Darwin grew up, and a lot of his family were Unitarians. These are people you find a lot in New England. They believed in God, they believed in Jesus, but they didn't think Jesus was the Son of God. So they only believed in the one God. So they denied the Trinity. So that's why they're called Unitarians. But they certainly thought that Jesus was an exceptional human being, and that when Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, care about the poor, the sick, those in prison and everything, they said, yes, having slaves is not compatible with what Jesus tells us in Matthew 5. And I think Darwin grew up with this. So when he came up with this theory about natural selection through a struggle for existence, Darwin said, okay, now how am I going to reconcile these two things I believe? On the one hand, I think there's going to be ongoing struggle for strength, like the lions, and for sex, like the humans. I mean, not that humans don't fight for strength and lions don't fight for sex, but I'm giving these as clear-cut examples. So Darwin said, yes, that's my theory, but my belief is that we ought to care about people. And Darwin always emphasized helping others, the importance of altruism, the importance of caring about others. Next, please. Friends. Now, this is where Darwin made his big move. This is where Darwin made his big move. He said, think about it. In the struggle for existence, yes, beating the other one may be important, but often the way you're going to beat the other one is not by dashing in and trying to do it all yourself. It's much better to work with others, much better to form relationships. Because, yeah, you might win and get the whole loaf, but you might equally lose and get no loaf. Isn't it better to say, let's decide before we start that if we win, we'll each get half a loaf? Yes, we will. And aren't we now going to be in a much better position taking on the opponent if there's two of us working together? Oh, yes, I suppose it is. And so now the point is, this isn't just going to happen by people sitting down and deciding this and spending all their time arguing. No, what you need is some way of this sort of kicking in automatically, being part of your biology, wanting to help. And so this is what Darwin said, is, yeah, it's winning in the struggle for existence or the struggle for reproduction doesn't mean necessarily going in and being the one person, the Muhammad Ali who beats everybody. No. Often the way we do it is by working together. More than this, Darwin said, look at human beings physically and compare them, let's say, with lions. If we wanted to put a human being and a lion in the arena, well, we know the Romans told us what happens. The lions ate the humans. Now, suppose humans were all like lions. Suppose, you go to class and there you are with your talons and everything and your aggressive nature. And let's say one of your fellow classmates, I don't know, says something to cheese you off or gets the place next to the pretty girl or handsome boy that you hope to have. Now, what are you going to do? If you like a lion, what you're going to do is start fighting the guy. And before you know where you are, the classroom is a bloodbath. It's like, the Roman arena. No. Notice that humans aren't that strong. I mean, they're comparatively, but they're not so strong. They don't have weapons of attack. We don't have talons, and we don't have, jaws and teeth which can tear our opponents apart. We're softies in that way. And also we have other adaptations. So this is one. Think about this. Coming into heat or having a period, being in heat. Most animals, like my dogs, if they come into heat, well, give up trying to have anything, run anything. I mean, suppose you take a dog in heat into a room where there's half a dozen other dogs, 4 of whom are male. Well, you're certainly not going to teach philosophy under those circumstances because you know what's going to happen. Now, think of that in your classes. If you turn up for class on a Monday morning and there's, let's say, 20 of you, and you're going to do, let's say, English, and you're going to read, let's say, Emily Dickinson. You're going to read some poems by Emily Dickinson. But one of the class is in heat. So suddenly, sniff, 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 sniff. You're not going to get to the second line of Emily Dickinson because it's all going to break down. But of course, it doesn't happen with humans. We have concealed ovulation. When women come in, have their periods, they're not, as it were, in heat. They're not at all. So this is another adaptation that we have to make us social. And I like this little picture. I feel sad. Now, the guy doesn't say, what are you going to give me? Give me something and I'll look after you. No, it's okay. I'm here with you. Me too. Me three. Yeah, I'm here with you. I care about you. Let me be your pal. He's not saying it's in my interests to have her on my side or something like. No, he's not saying that. He's reaching out as a human being to her. Next one, please. And the Mental Health Foundation knows this. Doing good does you good. Evidence shows that helping others can have a positive effect on your own mental health and well-being. And we all know that that's true. We all know that that's true. Helping others is the way to happiness. Helping others. Look, think of it this way. Think of a group of people. Let's say you do class or committee or something like that. And think of the two kinds of people. There's one kind, well, I like to talk about a philosophy department, and one of the faculty falls ill, and there's a class that's got to be taught on Monday. We're now at Friday afternoon. On Monday at 10, somebody's got to go in and man that class. So the chairman calls in 2 people. One person he calls in and says, will you teach this class for us on Monday? Joe's sick. And the person says, no, I couldn't possibly. It's not my field. I don't do that sort of thing. In any case, I'm busy this weekend. No, I can't do it. Get somebody else. And the other person comes in and says, what? And what he does is use a lot of very, very rude words about the chair. I know that. We all do that. I'm not going to say what the words are, but I'll let you fill in the blanks. And then the person says, all right, where's the textbook? Where's the text? And he takes the textbook, or she takes the textbook. And on Monday, they teach the class always one step ahead of the class because they've read the textbook. Now, I want you to ask the second question is, who's the happy person of those two? Well, you know perfectly well who it is. You know perfectly well that it's the guy or guyess who helps. You know perfectly well that the person who says, oh, crikey, you would do this. All right, where's the textbook? I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it. Oh, God. Yeah, give it to me now. Or the one who says, no, this is not my field. I couldn't possibly. They always say I've got integrity or something like that. And then you ask yourself, is this person really a happy person? And 9 times out of 10, you say, they're not really that satisfied in life. They're not really getting that much out of life that some of us are. I mean, as I say, I've been in philosophy departments for over 50 years, and I see it again and again and again. So what I'm saying is what Darwin says. Fighting is not always the best way to win. Often it's cooperating. But in order to cooperate, you've got to have something stimulating you. And that's emotions, feelings, those sort of things. You don't sit down every time something's got to be done and say, oh, yes, that kid's running into the road. Should I dash in and save the kid? Now, What will the parents give me? What will I get? Will I get praise? No, you don't do that. You say, come on, blah, 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 blah. Even though sometimes it goes wrong and you get knocked down and killed too. But that's the way that humans work. And so this is what Darwin wants to say is, okay, next please. In fact, God and Darwin. I want to say what's really interesting is that despite what Pat Robertson says, despite what Richard Dawkins says, in many respects, I see an awful lot of overlap between Christianity and Darwinism. I expect that because Darwin grew up in, as I said, he's a great revolutionary, but he's not a rebel. Darwin grew up in a Christian society and absorbed all of this. Darwin was not somebody sitting in a garret saying, I'm going to get at them. I'm going to destroy society. Absolutely not. The last thing Darwin wanted to do was destroy society. He was having a great time in it. It was, society was very good to Charles Darwin and his wife, Emma. I mean, so he wasn't going to do that. So what I'm saying is that Darwin's theory, in many respects, I think, wants to overlap with Christianity. Now, I want to say just one more thing before I finish. Oh my God, I'm going on. Let me say one more thing. Go on. Please move on. Next one. What I do want to say is that doesn't mean to say that everything is static. And let me end this very quickly by saying, in many respects, I get the feeling that science, generally, Darwinism in particular, is making the running a bit when it comes to morality. I don't mean that Christianity and science, Darwinism, are necessarily opposed, but you think of some of the tense issues, social issues in our society today. Let's start with gays, lesbians, bis. Let's start with them. Well, we know that there's been a huge amount of controversy about this. And certainly, I live in the American South, and my God, I can tell you that every church in our neighborhood, evangelical, pretty much every Sunday is saying how bad gay marriage is. And look, we've just had this woman, who's being considered for the Supreme Court. Actually, she's going to be on the Supreme Court. And one of the issues that has just come up is, where do you stand on gays and lesbians? And it's pretty clear she's a very conservative Catholic. And whether she's going to try and overturn it, but she is not in favor of treating gays and lesbians and bis and transsexuals as the same kind of worthwhile human beings as others. She does not think that they should be able to have the same sexual rights, the same social rights, getting married. And why? Well, of course, so much of this goes back to the Bible. Do you not know, this is St. Paul, do not be deceived, fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, homosexuals are being put in the same category as idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, thieves, greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers. That's not what I call LGBT friendly. Now, of course, this is the point I want to make. A lot of Christians would say, I don't believe this, I haven't believed this. My wife's very friendly with some people. We're not Christians, but very friendly with some people in the first Presbyterian down here in Tallahassee. And I know that the minister and the people who work there are more concerned and more in favor of gay marriage than any other group in town. So what I'm saying is, of course, why is this? Not because they got it straight out of Christianity, but because they've been able to let their Christianity evolve and develop in the light of what we know from science. We know that gays and lesbians are not people, who are spending all their time in the gay bars having sex. Oh no, they're perfectly happy to get married and all of these things. I've got a son who's gay, and he's been with his partner for 10 years, and a more conservative, boring human being you couldn't imagine. He's a male nurse. He's just done a master's degree in nursing, so he's now teaching us. A more respectable member of society. It would be hard to meet, except his lover that he lives with, his companion, who's a banker. My God, you can't get more boring and respectable than bankers. Next, please. Same with women. Same with women. We know that scientists and others today say, look, let us tell you, it is absolutely not true that because women have smaller brains than men, yes, they do, because they're smaller animals than men, that they're not as intelligent as men. They're not as capable. I know that. When I started teaching or going to university 60 years ago, the classes were 70% men, 30% women. And that was a change from earlier before the war. Now, and any prof will tell you, you go into class, undergraduate class these days, and undergraduate classes are always 60% women, 40% men, if not more, if not more. And do I feel that, oh dear, it's a terrible time, people aren't as good as they used to be? Oh, nonsense. No, it doesn't work that way. But you look at Christianity, women should remain silent in the churches. They are allowed to speak, but must be in submission, the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husband. It is a disgrace for women to serve the church or preach in the church. I went to a mega church about 10 years ago, and I said, you've got all these, you tell me you've got 23 ministers, 23. I said, how many of them were women? He shook his head and he said, well, we have a lot of women on faculty with PhDs, but we have not yet felt the call to ordain women. Well, there you go. Well, as I say, I'm not saying science is the only thing which has changed a lot of Christian, First Presbyterian and others, their views, but it certainly has. Last, please. Next, please. This is the end one. Foreigners and non-Christian, you know how big a thing this is with Trump and the wall and trying to throw immigrants out and not giving, people who've been there all their lives proper status. Blasphemers the Lord should be put to death. Congregations certainly be stoned, as well as the stranger and he in the land. When he blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be put to death. In other words, don't let anybody know you're a Muslim because, we're going to go after you. I mean, goodness gracious. Or somebody like me, somebody who says, oh, yeah, I like a lot of Christians, but I just can't accept the Christian God. I don't know. I just don't have that. Well, we're going to put you to death pretty sharpish. But of course, most Christians, at least in my kind of circles, obviously not all, because there's a hell of a lot of evangelicals supporting Donald Trump, a lot of evangelicals supporting Donald Trump. But the Christians I mix with would look at me as though I was queer in the head. I mean, the Christians I mix with are always the people who are leading groups in town into faith groups where the Jew, I mean, we've got it. There was something about one of our ministers retiring in the paper today. Well, he's retiring. He said, one of the things he's been doing over the last 30 years has been interfaith relationships. He said, this man, Brunt Copeland, his name is, and the local rabbi and the local imam, and I think maybe even another one, they are the people who have done more for the poor and immigrants in our town, in our society, than any others. And they have always worked entirely together, and they have never, ever been prejudiced against somebody because of their religious beliefs. Now, as I say, I think a lot of Christians are that way. But again, I think so much of it comes from science. Science says, look, folks, we've done racial studies. We've done genetic studies on humans. Humans, as they said, there was only 10,000 of them, very few. We're almost all the same. We're not subspecies. We're all the same. So let me finish, because I've obviously gone on way longer than I should have done. But once I start talking, you can tell why I love being a teacher. What I want to say is, I don't see that science and religion are necessarily clashing. I think they can work together. But I think often in our society, it's science which is making the running. I don't mean that religion's wrong, but I think particularly in our society today, science is often making the running and showing religious people the way to go. I think the religious people have shown us, including scientists, how to go. I think the thing has changed a bit. But what I want to say is there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't all work together. Thank you. Finished.
Thank you. So now we'll start the Q&A session. If you're getting extra credit for a particular teacher, then make sure to put your teacher in parentheses. Okay, got a question. You've mentioned how Darwin believed in altruism. Since Immanuel Kant was born almost 90 years before Darwin and believed that all beings are worthy of respect, do you believe that the beliefs of Darwin and Kant align in some ways, or even further, do you believe Kant had influenced Darwin and others in that period of time?
Yes, that's a very good question. I don't know how much Kant Darwin actually read himself. In The Descent of Man, he certainly quotes him. But Darwin had a very good classical education. And one of his teachers was a man called William Whewell. It's spelt Whewell, but it's Whewell. And basically, Whewell was a Kantian. So there's no question that Darwin knew about Kant, and I think in many respects was deeply influenced, let's say, by the Kantian philosophy. I'm not saying he got it, he sat down and read the Critique of Pure Reason, but I don't think there's any doubt there. And I think what is even more interesting is that, of course, Kant's philosophy says we don't see things in the world, we interpret the world through the way we see it. And I think Darwin said exactly the same. In fact, he was quite open about that. He said, I don't think that we just see the world as it is. I think that we interpret it. He said, I think we interpret it because of things that have been given to us by natural selection. But in many respects, that's deeply Kantian, deeply Kantian. So I see an awful, I personally think Kant's the greatest philosopher of them all. And I certainly see Kant influencing Darwin, even though I don't think there's a lot of evidence that Darwin sat down and read a lot of Kant.
Thank you. You mentioned a possible overlap between Darwinism and religious views on the origin of the universe and life. Is it possible to apply the idea of divine intervention and Darwinism? In other words, could evolution by natural selection have been set in motion by God? Is it
Well,
possible to synergize them?
well, obviously, if you're a Christian, you think it was. No doubt about that. I mean, that's the name of the game. The question is, how is it set in, or how does God work? And I think most Darwinians would feel very uncomfortable if people said, as the intelligent design people say, well, everything goes along awfully well. And then suddenly we get to a roadblock and God has to intervene. In other words, miracles. I think most Darwinians say, back off there, back off there. What we'd like to say is, if God's any good as a God, he knew all of these things before we started. And it wasn't necessary for God to get involved. But I think a lot of people would say, it's not really that relevant. The question is the meaning of the thing. I remember I mentioned Dunkirk, where the English got off, the British army got off, when Hitler's troops were all around them. Why did they get off? Because that weekend, the English Channel was like a pond, absolutely flat. Now, you could get terrible gales. I mean, after D-Day, there was a terrible gale later in June, which messed up all the artificial harbors and everything. But that weekend, it was. Now, when I grew up, everybody talked about the miracle of Dunkirk, the miracle. But if anybody had been asked, did God actually intervene then? Or was it the laws of nature that did it? They'd look at you as, that's not relevant. The question is the meaning of the thing, the meaning. The meaning was God made it possible for the British to keep in the game and go back and fight Hitler again. And that's the miracle. That's the miracle. So I think a lot of Christians, and if I were a Christian, this would be my position, is I think the idea of whether God intervenes in his creation as we go along, I don't think it's true, but somehow it's not relevant. It's just not relevant. What's really relevant is that organisms live, they flower, that we've got to the stage where we can have a Saturday afternoon doing this. That's what's relevant. And if I'm a Christian, I say, thank you, God, for making this possible. You don't have to do the miracles along the way to do this. The miracle is that it happens.
Thank you. You mentioned or you argued, I believe, that you can use Darwinism to still justify cooperative morality, but do you think that like the natural order of evolution and natural selection should be the guide for what a society should be, or is it simply a justification if you want to subscribe to that?
No, I think it's true. I mean, obviously, I've only given you part of the story because obviously we've got culture, and culture makes a big difference. And another thing, of course, is it's all very well talking about cooperating, but we've had war. Think of the wars in the 20th century. I think a lot of Darwinians, a lot of anthropologists would say, in a way, we're in a strange situation that we didn't really evolve for. It's only with the coming of agriculture in the last 10,000 years that wars have happened. Up to then, we were just bands of hunter-gatherers there was so much land, we basically didn't interact. There was certainly no question of wars. I mean, you might get killed. And it's only with the coming of agriculture, which led to a huge population explosion and less land, that wars come about. And look at how so often wars are wars of expansion. The First World War, I'm just actually reading a book right now that I've got. It's called The War That Ended Peace, The Road to 1914. And what's it about? It's about the fact that Germany, after it was unified in 1870, didn't think it had got enough room. So it was, pushing out like that. Second World War, what was that? You read Mein Kampf, Hitler's quite blunt about it. We need Lebensraum. So I'm not saying that wars don't have any genetic basis but to a certain extent, I see wars as maladaptive, as things which have gone wrong because of things that we've done. And obviously agriculture's a cultural thing. So we all know that culture can backfire very badly. And I suspect a lot of this is going on now. I think essentially, I'm an optimist. I think that basically humans are decent human beings. I couldn't have been a philosophy prof for 55 years without basically thinking that my students are decent human beings.
Was that the last question, Jack?
Yes.
Okay.
On time.
So, Dr. Ruse, thank you so much. I hope I can speak for everyone when I say that was amazing. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too and enjoyed the good art and the cool reptile factoids and all of that. It was lovely to have you. Would you like us to put your email or plug anything in chat?
Yeah, why don't you let the class have my email? If anybody wants to write to me quietly, personally, I'm more than happy to respond. Hell, I'm retired, I'm stuck with the pandemic, I can't go anywhere, so I might as well email students.
Awesome.
Anyhow, if nothing else, I hope you can see how lucky I have been. I love being a teacher. I absolutely love being a teacher. And I hope that came across today. I was doing this because I was having terrific fun.